who's also a partner on the education law team, and by David Ruddy, who's a barrister working with us, who's practiced in the area of education law. Some of you may know David from his time as president of the IPPN. Before we start, I would like to especially thank Paul Burns from NAPD for his great help in getting this webinar up and running. You don't need us to tell you that the issue of reopening schools safely in the context of the ongoing pandemic is a hot topic. Some people think that schools should reopen immediately, others take the opposite view. In any event, the government has decided that schools are going to reopen in September, and that's what we have to plan for. The minister has indicated that he will be publishing a roadmap in the next 2 weeks or so, which is great. And we hope that that roadmap will address in detail many, if not all, of the issues that we're going to talk to you this morning about. So what we're hoping to do this morning is to identify the issues that are going to arise and to look at how those issues might be addressed. We're going to, I should say, in the context of the roadmap, we will be returning to this complex issue later in the summer when we see what's in the roadmap. We're going to look at the international situation, and I'm going to talk to you initially about the background, the various published guidance and supports that are available to schools. And the obvious one is the World Health Organization, which you'll all be familiar with. It updates its guidance regularly. And there's a variety of government publications from such bodies as the HSE, the Health and Safety Authority, the National Standards Authority. The DES roadmap is coming out later this month. There's a very important DES circular, 24 of 2020, which we'll be talking to you about later. There's material from the management bodies, from the NAPD, and from the teacher unions. I'm going to hand you over now to David, who's going to talk to you about some of the considerations that you'll need to take into account. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Liam, and good morning, everyone. The starting point for the Department of Education and Skills in crafting the roadmap would be the World Health Organization publication, Considerations for Schools. And this publication is, as Liam referred to, is a live document, and it is something I think that's essential reading for us. And one of the interesting points in the publication is in relation to spacing and social distancing. And they state that schools must operate, their recommendation is at least 1 meter, which obviously is a lesser amount than what our government are recommending presently. They don't say there's a need for daily temperature checks or indeed in relation to wearing masks, but they say if there's a national policy in relation to either or, that schools should follow that. They advocate the use of more outdoor lessons, but that's not going to be very realistic given the Irish weather. I know that we've had wonderful weather recently, but that's not practical, particularly at post-primary level. One of the issues they highlighted was the question of school transport and safety on school transport. And we know that that's going to be a huge challenge to you, particularly as you plan the reopening of your schools, because most schools, rural or indeed urban, depend heavily on transportation. And it's something that's outside our control. So that's something that you will have to bear in mind. They also state that we should revisit our policies, health and safety, obviously, and we're going to discuss that and indeed code of behaviour and other policies during this webinar. And critically, they state that if anybody is unwell, they stay at home. And to add to that, we have the benefit of the international experience, as we're going to be one of the last schools in Europe to reopen. And in anticipation of this webinar, I rang a friend of mine who is CEO of a group of schools in the greater Stockholm area in Sweden. And he said absenteeism is an issue, because if in doubt, you stay out, as it were, and that applies for staff and pupils. So that's an issue you're going to have to contend with. It's going to be serious in relation to staffing issues, I would suggest. But he said, while I was curious about social distancing, he said it could be an issue, particularly for them at break times. It was an issue, but he said the parent issue was even greater, keeping parents and visitors off the school premises. And he alluded to the term essential visitors. They were the only people that were being allowed into the school. In relation to other countries that we have looked to, Denmark and the Netherlands, they have different social distancing requirements. As you can see, they're 1 meter at 1.5. And in Norway, schools have opened this week, and I gather there isn't social distancing. So I suppose it's a little bit all over the place, as it were. But we will learn, and by the time you do reopen in late August, we will have even learned from the UK experience. In relation to South Korea, South Korea has been hailed up, as you know, as the place we all want to be in relation to testing. But interestingly, in relation to schools, they reopened, and some schools had to close after 2 weeks because there were issues there. And we can see a dining hall here with the screens. Also, Professor Luke O'Neill stated 2 nights ago that of 20 countries that reopened their schools, only 3 had issues. In other words, the rate of infection in the 17 other countries did not increase with the reopening of schools. So that's very positive. Moving on from that, we're now going to look at the already published return to work safety protocol for the workplace. And Liam, you're going to take us through that, if you will.
Thanks, David. Some of you may have seen our easing on this last week. The government in early May published a return to work safety protocol for employers, and obviously schools are employers of the teachers and other staff who work in them. And so there's an obligation on school management, on boards of management, to do a number of things. And the first is to develop a COVID-19 response plan. And as part of that, you have to appoint and train worker representatives. The idea behind the plan is that you look at how your staff and your function as an enterprise, as it were, is affected by COVID-19. The good news is that the Health and Safety Authority has produced a template in relation to to preparing a COVID-19 response plan, and that is helpful. You as employers have to maintain a log of contacts to facilitate tracing. So in the school context, this would entail being able to identify all visitors to the school, all essential visitors to the school. Obviously, nobody else should be coming to the school. There's a need to update health and safety statements. There's a need to communicate updated public health advice to your staff. And there's a need to identify COVID-19 prevention and control measures. So these are the main features of the protocol. This is what you have to do, essentially.
And Liam, bearing in mind the huge challenges post-primary schools have at the moment with the particular grades and that, I have a question in here from a principal who says, should schools await further definitive advice? I suppose they're really referring to the roadmap, or should we start working on the return to work plan now? What would you do if you were in their position?
Well, I would start preparing now. Obviously, whatever you do is going to be affected by whatever's in the minister's roadmap. But start thinking about it now. Start looking at the templates. Start considering what's going to have to go into your response plan, because the return to work safety protocol. It's out there. It applies to employers, and you're going to have to comply with it in some shape or form anyway. So that's not going away. You're going to have to do it. So whatever's in the roadmap is not going to affect the existence of the protocol itself. It may clarify it. It may help you in doing this, but definitely I wouldn't. I know schools are overwhelmed at this time of the year, with, particularly this year, but I think we have to find some space for this.
So Liam's message is now is the time. Thanks for Liam.
Yeah, thanks.
We're now going to move on to, as it were, the meat in the sandwich, the details in this protocol for your particular school. And Paul is going to take us through that. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, David, and good morning, everybody. Well, as Liam has said, schools are employers. That return to work protocol is out there, and you will have to follow it and abide by it in some shape, manner, or form. But obviously, there is more to school life and operation than that. So a clear policy statement to all members of your school community, staff, students, and parents is going to be essential in order to make this work. So in conjunction with or parallel to the return to work protocol, you're going to need to start planning for this and putting together your policy for how you're going to reopen your school. And as we've said, there will be a roadmap in a couple of weeks. There will likely be changes to public health guidelines as we move through the summer. So you're going to have to continue to be aware of those as you make your plan and formulate your policy. And you're going to have to consult with staff, with students, and with parents as you go along in putting that together. But some of the things you can start thinking about now, and I would echo Liam's comment that now is the time to start, notwithstanding all the other commitments you have. So social distancing is going to be with us for the rest of this year, probably at least. So you're going to have to factor that into your planning. People are coming back, they haven't seen each other in person in a number of months. They may, forget themselves or have, an inclination to shake hands or whatever. You're going to have to make it very clear what the rules on social distancing continue to be. Once you have your plan in place, or once you're formulating your plan, how are you going to communicate that to your school community? How are you going to train staff? How are you going to provide whatever guidance is required for pupils and parents in relation to how school is going to operate in this new setting? So are you going to do that online in advance? Are you going to have social distancing instruction sessions at the very start of the year? Think about that. Cleaning is something that has been probably talked about quite a bit and is going to be important, both in terms of most schools have a deep clean for the summer anyway. There will be some additional considerations this year, but also then in terms of how your school is normally cleaned. Do you have in-house cleaners? Do you have a contract cleaning company who does that work for you? You're going to have to liaise with them. You're going to have to set out clear protocols for cleaning on an ongoing basis, both weekly and daily. You may need additional equipment for that. You will more than likely need additional funding for that. You need to going to have clear signage around the school in terms of how things work, how people move, reminding people of the rules about social distancing, etc. That's going to be essential. You're going to need to consider what happens when somebody develops symptoms and how you're going to deal with that. And obviously that will be led by public health guidelines. There may be something in the department roadmap in relation to that too, but you're going to have to be very clear, and everybody, both staff and students and parents, are going to have to be very clear as to how that's going to be dealt with, and all of the things that fall out of that in terms of removing that person from the school, how you interact with the HSE in terms of contact tracing, etc., and various data protection issues that we're going to touch on later. Things such as staggering breaks, staggering start and finish times, staggering moves between classes, which is more particular to the post-primary sector, where students are moving around from one class to another, or from a practical class or laboratory to another classroom. How are you going to manage that movement or flow of students around your school? And that may be more challenging for some schools than for others in terms of the physical layout of their buildings. So you may need to look at that, particularly then in terms of practical subjects, another issue that's more particular to post-primary. How are you going to handle those science subjects, metalwork, woodwork? How are you going to lay out your laboratories or your practical rooms? How are you going to manage whatever group work might have been previously included in the syllabus? How are you going to deal with the cleaning of equipment and laboratories and rooms, both before and after classes take place? So these are all the practical considerations that you're going to need to look at. And then tied to that, because sometimes those practical classes can give rise to accidents, both small and large. But in the general sense across the school, first aid, you will have arrangements and plans in relation to the provision of first aid within the school. You're going to have to revisit those. How are they going to work now in COVID? Are you going to need additional PPE, for example, for people who are administering first aid? If so, where are you going to get that, and how are you going to train people how to use it? So lots of things to turn your mind to. The other thing I think is important to say is you're going to make a plan, you're going to issue it, you're going to try and put it into operation. But then when we actually open our schools and get in there, you're going to have to tweak that plan. Things are going to change, and you're going to see things that work or don't work. So you're going to need to be prepared to be flexible. Both management, staff, and students and parents are going to need to keep flexibility to the forefront of their mind and be open to amending that plan and changing it, with the required or kind of the necessary consultation. But that this is all about keeping people safe while continuing to operate the school. And that's the starting point for any discussion, I think, in relation to this. But you're going to need to have further discussion, I think, once the school opens. It's not going to be a static thing where you kick off and that's the end of that.
And Paul, like the health and safety statement, all members of staff have to share the burden of this plan. This is not just a plan that has to be the responsibility of management and the board. It's of all members of staff. And I think it would be important, I think you'd agree, communicated.
I think all members of staff, I think, this is a whole school community issue. I think, school management will be well served by good, early and frequent communication with staff, with students and with parents to get them all on board with this. Because the primary concern here, and we'll talk about this, a couple of different junctures in this session, is about safety, but also about doing that in a way that allows us to continue the operation of the school. So everyone is going to have a part to play in that.
And speaking of everyone, Paul, it seems to me that ancillary staff are going to have a key role in the reopening of schools and in the maintenance of that reopening. Would you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, I don't think we would say that schools take their ancillary staff for granted, but I think they often do their work in the background with a minimum of fuss, and they could potentially be overlooked in terms of the planning process. So I think we need to turn our minds to what the requirements are there. So, the school secretary is very often the first point of contact for a lot of people coming in and out of the school. Secretary's offices are used for a variety of things, maybe printing, photocopying as a waiting area before meetings. So you need to look at that based on the physical layout of your school and your secretary's area or office. Are you going to need screens like we see in our local supermarkets now? Are you going to need protocols about the use of printers or photocopiers? Are they going to have to be physically moved to different locations so you provide a safer environment for the school secretary? And protocols which will be published to parents and students about how they are able to interact with the secretary's office. Your cleaners we've already touched on. You're going to need to engage in some planning with them, either in internal or on an external basis, about how they go about their business, whether they need additional equipment, whether they need additional PPE, and how is that going to be funded. All of those conversations will need to be had. To your point about the participation of other staff and other members of the school community, there is going to be a need for day-to-day cleaning of surfaces, door handles, desks, other areas. How is that going to be managed? And based on what's set out in public health advice and the department roadmap, what is the requirement there and how are we going to manage it? You're going to need to think about that. The other person in the school that we need to consider is the caretaker. So, does our caretaker need additional training? Will he need additional PPE? How, in terms of when the caretaker goes to do a piece of work somewhere within the school, does that area need to be cleaned before the caretaker does that work? Does it need to be cleaned again afterwards? All of these additional considerations. The other point of making in relation to ancillary staff is that in a lot of cases, Ancillary staff can sometimes come from a particular age cohort. And I know we've had a couple of queries in relation to that already. So that's something that's going to need to be considered about whether they form part of a vulnerable group, or extra consideration needs to be taken there. I know we're going to talk about that later. And then the final point I would touch on in this is in relation to after school activities, both in terms of location and then in terms of staffing. So our view, I think, as a team is that the indoor after school activities are probably still going to pose a high risk for some time. And school management would want to consider, give significant consideration before deciding whether or not to go ahead with that. I think external or outdoor after school activities pose a much lower risk. But obviously, as you mentioned earlier on, that's going to become more difficult as we get further into the autumn term and you get into November and December and January. Very often that's practically not possible. So lots of things to consider and lots of potential changes and additional pieces of work to be done in this area as we move through the summer.
Thanks, Paul. And I'm now going to move on to the pre-return to work form is required to be completed at least 3 days in advance. And Liam, before you reference this, just can I flag just some questions that have come in? One is, what happens if a member of staff does not return the form or forgets to do so? Another issue is in relation to a substitute teacher or SNA arriving at the school. And I can imagine principals being desperate to have that cover. And then I suppose in the context of post-primary schools, we have the substitution and supervision circular. And as we know, a lot of post-primary teachers opted out of supervision, which means that the school management have to hire in people to do supervision, often for very small, limited times in the day, be it at the start or lunch break or at the end of the school day. So with that in mind, Liam, would you like to just take us through this or give us your thoughts?
Sure, David. The completion of the return to work form is a requirement of the return to work safety protocol. So it's not an option. It's mandatory on all employees. So the advice that we would give to principals and school managers is you don't let anyone, any employee, return to school on the school reopening without having completed the form. Now, the key phrase here is in advance. In other words, you have to have the form completed by all of the people employed in the school before they come back to work. Ideally, you want it, well in advance, at least 3 days in advance, but you absolutely have to have it before they come back to work. And I wouldn't let anyone into the school without having completed the return to work form. The form itself is self-explanatory. It's a form of self-certification in relation to whether you've either had COVID-19 or whether you have symptoms or whatever. It's not dissimilar to the type of declarations that teachers fill out in relation to child protection and so on. So it's essential that everyone follows it. I know this will pose some difficulties for the likes of occasional workers, such as people involved in supervision, but the essential point remains the same for them as well. In other words, before they come into the school for the first time in September, they've got to complete this form and give it to you. Issues may arise down the line in relation to people who may be working in the school for a while and then are gone for some considerable time. And it may be necessary when they're coming back that they fill that form in again. But I expect that there will be further public health advice in relation to that ongoing situation, if you like, as we progress through the autumn. But in terms of reopening in September, the red line is every employee in the school must complete this form, must get it to you as school management before they're allowed back to work. If they refuse to do so, well, we can talk about that a bit later, but it's not a desirable option, it's mandatory.
Thanks for that. And that's another consideration for management as part of your preparation. We now move on to the elephant in the room, as it were. Paul, do you anticipate that pupils are going to behave like we have in the slide here? I know that both you and I have school-going children, and we hear different stories, raising stuff on that. It's going to be difficult, isn't it, for schools?
It is going to be difficult, David, and I think, you know, a prime example of that is anybody who was out and about over the most recent bank holiday weekend will have seen, you know, young people out and about. You know, it's very difficult to counteract the natural tendencies they have to gather together with their friends, particularly where they may not have seen them for a protracted period. But from a school management point of view and from a legal risk point of view, it's absolutely incumbent on school management to put in place whatever the protocols are at that point in time when we reopen. And as I said, it's possible that public health advice is going to change on that and maybe set out in the roadmap from the department. As you mentioned earlier on, you know, Norway schools reopened this week without social distancing. We saw earlier on one of the earlier slides the various different distances and regimes that exist in other jurisdictions around Europe. So, you know, we'll probably learn from those during the month of June, and we may see a different arrangement for schools in September. I think the minister alluded to that.
Sorry, Paul, could I just interject there just to say, I was watching the BBC News last night, and there was an item on about schools in Wales, and they looked at the school where the principal was trying to figure out how he was going to accommodate students with the 2 meter separation, and he reckoned he'd only be able to get about a third of the students back in at 2 meters. And I think they're saying the same in the north of Ireland. But the minister has said that he wants to have all students back in school. He's not happy with the situation where only a small number comes back. But with the 2 meter rule, that looks very difficult, doesn't it?
It does, and I think, you know, that's what the minister said, that it will be difficult, and I think probably practically most school principals and boards and teachers will recognise that that's not feasible for the vast majority of schools. They just don't have the physical space in order to be able to do that. So it may be that a change will come in that, but whatever the change is, I think the reality is social distancing is with us for a time to come. And we need to put in place those provisions, whatever they might be, through, you know, floor markings, through the arrangements we make, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the flow of people around our school buildings, start and finish times, how we manage break times, lunch times, whether we have a one-way system through the school. And, you know, part of doing that would be part of your health and safety risk assessment that can be built into that. To look at what the requirement is, look at the physical space of the school, and assess the risk and make adjustments accordingly. And as you know, as we'll touch on later on, if you've had the benefit of having an external health and safety consultant assist you with your health and safety statement, that's an ideal time to get them back in to revisit that.
Thank you, Paul. And in relation to vulnerable students, and that social distancing will even be doubly challenging.
It will. This is going to be a very difficult area for everyone concerned. I would at the outset just point out that we are planning a further webinar this month in relation to special schools and students with special educational needs generally. So some of these issues will be addressed in that as well. But I suppose it's fair to make the general point that, you know, when you're dealing with students with special educational needs, in certain cases you'll have students with intimate care needs. Anybody who has experience in the area will readily say that it's going to be impossible to maintain those kind of physical distances. So how are we going to manage that? What about the use of PPE, and what will the impact of that be on those students where the people they're used to dealing with and feel safe and secure with are now wearing very strange looking garb as far as they're concerned? And is that actually a realistic prospect? So I think, you know, there's going to need to be further guidance here. This is one of these areas where we don't have all the answers yet. We're going to need further guidance from the National Public Health team, I think, on this. We're going to need further guidance from the department on this. But what I would say is that as that guidance emerges, that school management should engage early and fully and then frequently with the staff and the parents of these students, and listen to their concerns and work with them to make this a workable solution, because I know there have been significant challenges for families where they have students with special educational needs and have been at home for this last period, and it's been very difficult. So they would certainly want to have their children back in a school environment in a safe way. So I think a lot of work is going to have to be done to get back to that. One point I would say is that it looks likely now that the July provision will proceed, although I understand it's not 100% secure, but I think the likelihood is it will proceed. If that does go ahead, I think we will learn a lot from that. I think a lot of these issues may be teased out during that period, and we'll be able to build on that and get a clearer picture of what's possible and what's necessary.
So things, Paul, won't be as daunting, hopefully, by the time schools reopen as it might appear at the moment.
Hopefully not.
Yeah. Thanks. We're now going to move on to an important circular 24/2020. This was published by the department back in March. They were under huge pressure to get their heads around the pandemic and how it would affect sick leave and that. And Liam, I'm just flagging again another question. You take us through it, and it's from a principal who says she has read through the circular, but she's a little confused about self-isolation, restricted movements, the requirements there. So if you may elaborate, and I know you've a life experience in representing boards of management in relation to employment issues, amongst other issues. So can you throw any
David.
first?
Good, thanks. I'll do my best. Yeah, this circular came in somewhat under the radar there at the end of March. It's an important circular in that it provides for a special leave with pay for teachers and SNAs in certain circumstances, and it sets out two scenarios. One is where what's called self-isolation. And the other is where there is restricted movement. Now, what's the difference? What are these two categories, and what's the difference between them? In relation to self-isolation, self-isolation is where you either have had symptoms of COVID-19 and you've been medically advised to self-isolate, to exclude yourself completely from contact with other people. You cannot voluntarily self-isolate. It's where you have the symptoms of the disease, or you've had the virus itself. So, with restricted movement, it's a bit more nuanced, if you like. Again, it's not something that you can you cannot, as a teacher or an SNA, you cannot voluntarily restrict your own movement. But restricted movement applies to two categories. The first is people who may have been in contact with persons who've had COVID-19 or who may have returned from abroad and so on, and they have been advised medically or by HSE to restrict their movements, not to have contact and so on. And then the second category within the category of restricted movement is at-risk groups. Now, what are at-risk groups? They are a specific category of people who are aged over 60, but who have one or other or more of a series of identified illnesses and conditions. So there's an age requirement over 60, and there is there's a health condition requirement on top of that. So if somebody says that they are that they are part of an at-risk group, they have to identify themselves as coming within one of the categories identified by HSE criteria as applying to an at-risk group. So it's not just something that you can just voluntarily put yourself into. Now, from the point of view of the circular, the department says that if you're in the restricted movement category, well, you're available for work, and if it's feasible, your school should enable you to work remotely from home. If that's not feasible, the circular provides that you can be deployed into the wider public service. Now, there's a lot of issues there, and they're not all fully teased out in the circular by any manner of means. And we'll have to see how this works out when the schools reopen. If you're self-isolating, you're not regarded as being available for work because you have the symptoms of the disease and you've been medically certified to self-isolate. The difference between the two is a bit nuanced, but for self-isolation, the department says you're not available for work. With restricted movement, you are.
So Liam, thanks for that clarification as much as you can, and it's something we may come back to when we do another webinar closer to the actual reopening. Yes, another big issue is the potential for litigation. And I'm going to ask Paul and Liam to take us through this, because we're reflecting on many of your questions coming in, and there is anxiety out there. So you might be able to give us some reassurance, both Paul and Liam. So I'll start with Paul, if I may.
Thanks, David. Yeah, look, I think the most important thing here to be clear about and to communicate this clearly as well to all affected groups within the school community is that there is no such thing here as a no risk return to school. I think that's been acknowledged. Taoiseach has said as much when he talked about this topic. What we're talking about here is managing and mitigating risk to the highest degree possible. So I think everybody needs to be clear about that at the outset. And I would say, in relation to that, from the point of view of just one point of view of staff, there is an obligation on Board of Management as an employer to provide a safe place of work for staff. But the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act, which governs that area, only talks about making it a safe workplace to the extent that is practicable. So it is not, and even the legislation doesn't require a 100% guarantee of safety at all times. That being said, it's absolutely the case that you will have to prepare and plan and put in place the correct protocols, procedures and provisions to minimize your risk of in relation to any future claim. We might often get a call from a principal or a chairperson of a board who has received notice of a claim from somebody, and they're somewhat incredulous that that claim has been made, and they'll say to us that there's no basis for it or whatever. And what I've often said to clients is, you cannot stop people initiating litigation or taking a claim where they feel that they may have a valid claim. There's no way to prevent them doing that. What there is a way to guard yourself against liability for that claim. So, be fully aware of the public health guidelines and the department roadmap and follow those. We've talked about health and safety. Do a proper risk assessment. Update your health and safety statement in relation to COVID. Take into account all of the things you need to do to comply with your obligations in that regard. And then there are specific areas you need to be aware of. So one of the questions we've been asked about is temperature testing for staff, which poses difficulties in relation to data protection and all of that. Again, dealing with suspected illness, that protocol and who gets informed and issues there. Wearing of PPE. If you decide that certain people within the school need to wear PPE to do their job, you need to make sure that they're properly trained in the use of it. Otherwise, you may be creating difficulties for yourself. Logging of contacts, as Liam mentioned earlier on, visitors to the school and that kind of thing. You need to be mindful of what happens to that data. The issue of personal injury litigation, the most obvious one being infection with COVID itself. But also you may see an issue in relation to anxiety or stress in the workplace in relation to returning to work as part of COVID. And I think Liam's going to deal more specifically with those employment related issues. And then you're going to have issues in relation to requests for reasonable accommodation, both from staff who are, going to have varying issues in relation to whether they have pre-existing conditions or they're in a part of a vulnerable group or whatever. But also then in relation to students, you may have situations where parents decide that, notwithstanding all the protections you put in place, they're not prepared to send their child back to school in September. So all of those will have to be considered on a case-by-case basis. You'll have to, I would say probably take specific advice in relation to each case, but you're obliged to consider those requests and do so in a reasonable manner. So there will be a lot of things to consider as you move through the summer into September on that front.
And if I could just come in there, Paul, just following on from what you've been saying, and just looking at how management might avoid or preempt any employment disputes arising when the school reopens. I think it's a good idea as part of your COVID-19 plan. You would make contact with your staff, and a good way of doing that would be to send them around a copy of the GPS Circular 24 of 2020, because you're obliged to do that anyway. And it's something that you mightn't have had an opportunity to do because of the lockdown. So I think that's a good way to sort of sound people out as to where they are in terms of coming back. There may be people on your staff who consider themselves to be at risk, but who may not objectively fall into one of the at-risk categories as identified by the HSE. And I think now would be a good time to suss that out, as it were. And a way of doing that would be in the context of your COVID-19 plan, your preparations, and then also the obligation on you to make them aware of the Circular 24 of 2020. So it's a good way to raise those issues in advance and to see what the response is from your own teams.
Thanks, Liam. And just before we move on, I have a question here that either of you, one of you might, and this is probably a typical enough sort of situation, or maybe I am not at risk personally, but my partner has an underlying condition. Do I have to return to school? This is the sort of area where... I'm happy to. My feeling on that is that from the point of view of the employer, and again, what will determine this is whether the employee is in an at-risk category. I don't want to be unsympathetic. I mean, obviously, you would have to feel for anyone in that situation, but my thinking on that would be that obviously you need to talk to that member of staff and see what it is that they are asking you to do. But if they are asking, can they become, are they covered by Circular 24 2020, whereby they would be restricting their movements and working remotely? I think you'd have to see whether they fell into the at-risk category as provided for in the circular. Because what the circular is very clear about is that you cannot voluntarily put yourself into the category of at risk. Some of the criteria of at risk have to apply to you as the employee. Now, obviously, we're going to have to be reasonable and flexible about this. And we're going to have to look at cases such as this on a case-by-case basis.
on the face of it, that scenario does not seem to me to be one that would entitle that employee to fall into the restricted movement category as set out in the circular. Now, whether you need to provide reasonable accommodation to that person, Shin Cashdella, but on the face of it, I don't think so, because your relationship is with that person as the employee, and they are not at risk themselves. What you might be able to do for them, it's a matter that you might be able to discuss with them in terms of reassuring them as to their own safety and at the extent to which you have mitigated the risk of their becoming ill.
Thanks for that clarification, Liam. And we now move on very quickly to the sanctions for breaches of the protocol. What do schools have in place to maintain safety? Liam, just in relation to disciplinary procedures? Just very briefly. Obviously, the last thing that principals want to do is to, have to come to heavy with a member of staff by way of the disciplinary procedures. But it's important to note that they are there, and that teachers and SNAs are obliged to cooperate with you in relation to the steps you're putting in place to mitigate risk in the school and to safeguard students and staff. If they refuse to do so, I would see that as being a disciplinary issue. It would be a refusal to comply with a reasonable direction. And I think the disciplinary procedures are there and should be availed of in those rare circumstances where somebody might just refuse point blank to cooperate with you. So just be aware of that. And then obviously the same applies for ancillary staff under what's known as SI 146 of 2000, which sets out disciplinary procedures. So just be aware of that. Thanks, Liam. And Paul, pupils who pose a health and safety threat to other pupils and indeed staff, and the position then of parents. What mechanisms have the school in place to deal with such behaviours?
Well, David, look, the code of behaviour is there. I know a lot of schools will have, if not amended the code itself, they will have issued perhaps an addendum to it during the recent period of remote teaching with some additional pieces in relation to that. But I think now is the time to be thinking about looking at your code of behaviour in relation to return to school and what additional pieces you're going to need to have in that in relation to the operating under COVID-19. I think, and obviously the normal processes, and be cognizant of the 2008 guidelines in relation to amending and reviewing that. But I think clearly communication to parents, reminding them that they have agreed, to this code of behaviour, that this is the applicable code for the school, and that there will not be any tolerance of breaches of it, because I think, this is a very significant area, and I think that if you are going to put this in and you're going to operate in a safe way come September, then you're going to have to deal with situations as they arise, because if you don't deal with them and something happens that puts health and safety at risk, then I think you're going to have difficulties further down the road if a claim arises or some issue in relation to liability. So I think everybody needs to be very clear what the standard is that's expected. It needs to be set out, communicated early and frequently to parents and students that that's the case. But then, as Liam said, in relation to staff, clearly if there's a breach, then it needs to be dealt with.
Thanks, Paul. I'm conscious that we're running out of time, but there was a question in relation to what a health and safety statement might look like in relation to the whole question of risk mitigation. Liam, I know this is a rough here, but it
is, David. It's a very rough template of what an amended health and safety statement might look like in the context of your carrying out a risk assessment in relation to COVID-19. But look, most schools are very familiar with health and safety requirements. They've been dealing with health and safety statements for decades. As Paul mentioned earlier, a lot of schools will have engaged external consultants in preparing their safety statements, and it might be worth going back to any consultants that you used to carry out a further risk assessment in relation to COVID-19.
Thank you, Liam. And at this stage, I'd like to thank both Paul and Liam for sharing their expertise with us this morning. There was a lot, I know, in this presentation, and our head of the education team, Ian O'Herlihy, is to email everybody with a link to a recording of the webinar. We would also like to point out, we just have done a list of steps you would consider in preparing for your return, and we'd ask you to give consideration to this. We will return to this question later on in the summer with a further webinar. We also have essential reading for you, and just to point out that other members of our team, Ian O'Herlihy and Catherine Kelly, were involved with a webinar for primary schools yesterday. And Fiona Shield, who's a solicitor with our department, also was involved in drafting an easing along with Liam in relation to employment concerns. You might get a chance to read that. We're just giving you other pointers here that we would see as essential reading. And above all, we would like to thank you for, I'm sorry with the slide here, something has gone wrong, but we've Ian and Catherine, but Liam and Paul, you also know on that, and I've alluded to Fiona. We would just like to thank you, all 650 people who registered today. Please contact us if you have any issues. And finally, we would want to wish you well in your preparations, and we look forward to meeting you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.